Hello, and welcome to this online broadcast on the 2015 edition of the ISO 14001 Environmental Management System Standards. First launched in 1996, ISO 14001 is used by hundreds of thousands of organizations worldwide, but the standard has been recently revised to bring it up to date to today's organizational and environmental challenges. My name is Maria Lazarte, and I'm ISO Social Media Manager. Today, I'm here with two experts who participated in the revision of the standard and who will tell you all you need to know about this new edition. So we have with us Anne-Marie Warris, who is the chair of the ISO committee responsible for ISO 14001. She's joining us from the UK. Hello, Anne-Marie. And I'm also here with Susan Briggs, who is the convener of the ISO working group that revised ISO 14001, and she is joining us from sunny Florida today.
Hi, everyone.
Thank you both for being here. Now, this week has been particularly interesting for the environmental agenda, with COP21 in full swing. Perhaps we can start the hangout with a few words on how ISO standards like ISO 14001 can concretely contribute to addressing the problem of climate change. Perhaps, Anne-Marie, could you tell us a little bit more about this?
Thank you, Maria, and hello to everybody. So COP21, the Conference of Parties, the 21st meeting of that, is going on in Paris at the moment, and we're very excited about what might be the outcome. We still don't know. We're waiting for some text. But I think it's important to recognize that all of ISO standards, one way or the other, will support the outcome of whatever comes out of Paris. So Paris will deliver, but standards will support. And we saw some of that in the ISO side event on carbon neutrality and risk that was held a couple of weeks ago. But what about ISO 14001? Well, ISO 14001, among other changes, now includes a requirement for organizations to take account of the effect of the environment on the organization. So thinking both from a perspective of what could happen from outside that impacts the organization, such as diminishing water resources, increased storms, more flooding. We've seen plenty of that here. We've seen drought in California this year. So we've seen lots of these examples. Or changes in the climate or weather, all of which an organization would sort of like to take account of in terms of planning their future. And all of that is part of adapting to climate change. And this is how ISO 14001 supports the negotiations in Paris. ISO 14001 will help organizations to adapt to the changing world that the COP21 results will bring to us, whether that's due to climate change or due to climate change affecting other environmental issues such as eco-services, and also supporting the development of UN Sustainable Development Goals published earlier this year will help if you have an ISO 14001.
Thank you, Anne-Marie, for this, and it is indeed quite an important event that's taking place right now, and we're pretty excited to see what comes out of this. But now for what people came to hear about, and that is what is new with the 2015 edition, which was published just in September this year, and it does feature quite a few important changes. So perhaps this time we can give this one to Susan. Can you tell us a little bit more about the main differences between the two editions?
Sure. There are some significant changes. So let me just start right off with one of the goals that we wanted to address is we wanted to enable 14001 to help organizations contribute to sustainability and do their part in terms of sustainable development. So first off, you're going to see that ISO 14001 takes a much more strategic approach to these environmental issues. Anne-Marie mentioned some of it, looking at how the organization affects it. And more importantly, we wanted to make sure that the environmental management system was aligned with other business priorities. So we're asking organizations to understand what are the important issues both for the organization's business and for the environment. And then use some risk-based thinking. What's most important? What are its priorities in balance with its other business priorities to identify those risks, those things that can cause adverse effects to the organization, and those things that are beneficial, actions that the organization can take that will benefit the environment, and determine which ones are most important for it to address and develop plans to address it. Hold on one second, got a little problem here. So Anne-Marie mentioned about effects on the organization. Environment is affecting organizations' business continuity. She mentioned water scarcity, rising sea levels. I know in some organizations that I've worked with, we've had these issues that affect the continuation of business production. So we've always addressed the emissions and effluents and waste that the organization has generates and its adverse effect on the environment, but now we're looking the other way. So it's a two-way street. We've expanded looking at our activities throughout all life cycle stages. We've always looked at materials that go into our processes, our manufacturing or production or service provision processes. But now we're looking beyond that. We're looking at the use of our products in market. We're looking about how we transport them and deliver those services. We're looking at end-of-life treatment of those products. What can we do to recycle or reuse our products in other ways instead of disposing of them? And then eventually there may be some that end up in some final disposal methodology, and so we're looking at those. And the point of looking at all of those stages is to look at how we can minimize environmental impacts throughout all of the life cycle stages. So we've expanded and incorporated what we call the life cycle perspective. Now, that's not a life cycle analysis. We're not looking at quantifying these impacts at the stages, at these various life cycle stages, but we want organizations to look at each stage and most effectively address it in the design of their products, address ways that they can reduce environmental impact at the design stage and address them then. We've also looked at communication. That was always a very debatable point in our negotiations of the previous versions, and now we're looking at requiring organizations to develop an environmental communication strategy and looking both internally at the communication that is required that will benefit the EMS and also looking externally. Every organization does communication externally, whether it's to satisfy compliance obligations, their legal requirements, or in terms of voluntary reporting initiatives such as carbon disclosure or GRI. These voluntary initiatives are a method of external communications, and organizations can choose to do those as well. We've added a lot more emphasis to environmental performance improvement. It has always been the intent that by improving the environmental management system, that you will improve environmental performance. But we've been criticized about that. And so we have now made it clear that one of the intended outcomes of an EMS is environmental performance improvement, reductions in emissions and effluents and waste, among other things, and reduction in the use of precious resources. And so you'll see a lot more emphasis in that throughout the standard, and that was a well-received improvement to the ISO 14001. I think, in general, what organizations will also see is a brand new structure and some new terms. Not that the intent is really any different with some of this new terminology, but it's new terms to make it clearer and simpler to understand. So first off, you're going to see compliance obligations. These are both what an organization has to comply with, like laws and regulations and permits to operate, but also their voluntary commitments that they make, as I mentioned earlier, voluntary external reporting. But there may be others that the organization chooses to adopt. And what's important about this is that once an organization decides what its obligations are, it must satisfy them. And so making sure that the EMS system addresses those in terms of controls and monitoring and measurement and evaluation and review. Another new term you're going to see is documented information, and we're all moving into an electronic computerized age, and documents are no longer captured on paper. And so what we wanted to do is move with the time and address both electronic, database, hard copy information that is required to be retained because it's important for the organization. And how to create it, how to control it, how to revise it, and how to retain it. And so you'll see this new phrase, documented information, throughout the standard. It's the same as the terms that we used to use, documentation, procedures, records, documents, same concept. And you certainly don't have to change the way that you use it in your organization, but you'll see it in the standard. And many of these new terms and the new structure that you'll see in ISO 14001 is as a result of ISO's initiative to align all management system standards.
Thank you very much, Susan, for this very comprehensive summary of the main changes. I see that there's a lot that seems to be going on in there, so perhaps we can focus on some of the key aspects a little bit more. One of the ones that drew my attention is the strategic and business management focus, as well as the wider context of the organization. And perhaps Anne-Marie can tell us a little bit more about this.
Thank you, Maria. I suppose it's a bit about going back to 1996, when ISO 14001 happened, and also taking out from ISO 9001 the idea that we put together management representatives, these people in a little corner box that looked after the environmental management system. And one of the big issues has always been the need to integrate the strategic directing of an organization. Where's an organization going? What's it trying to do? What's its market? Who is its suppliers? Where is it going to expand to? So those issues which you might see as the context of an organization, you need to integrate that thinking into what an environmental management system needs to be able to deliver. But you also need the environmental management system to take account of where an organization is going strategically. What's it planning to do? What's it thinking it's going to do? Who is it? And some of those things are, if you wanted a to and fro conversation, are part of this focus on strategic and business management. You see that as well as the increased focus on the commitment from the leadership, the need for top management to do certain things in the standard. Again, an integration of the environmental issues into the strategic direction of an organization. And I think the important point here is that both things have to work together. The organization tells the environmental management system where the organization is going, but the environmental management system, by taking account of the effects of the environment of the organization and its environmental impacts, tells the organization what it needs to think about. And then it gets feedback in terms of, here are the initiatives that we can allow you to go off and do. So these two things have to work together to be able to deliver a fully functioning environmental management system that is not standalone. It stands with the organization, inside the organization's business system, not in a little sidetrack of some friendly environmentalist to make us look green. Thank you, Maria.
Thanks, Anne-Marie, for that very clear explanation. Another issue, I think, that we've seen this on Twitter as well. Somebody sent a question about this that has it's quite important on this new edition. Seems to be the life cycle perspective. And perhaps, Susan, you can tell us a little bit more about what was the rationale behind the inclusion in the standard.
Thanks. The focus on life cycle perspective is something that has evolved, obviously, with the development of other ISO standards on life cycle assessment and the important contributions of organizations, not only organizations when they are producing their products, basically within the fence line of their facilities that produce products or provide services, but that there's more significant effects upstream and downstream from that operation. And we wanted organizations to take responsibility for them, since it's an important driver for their products. So we're looking at the materials and services that are used by the organization, their supply chain, the effects the suppliers have themselves in producing the components or providing the services that the organizations need to make their products. And also the raw materials that go into it. We've always had a focus in ISO 14001 on preventing pollution, but you'll see that the policy commitment has been expanded. It includes pollution prevention, but it talks about protection of the environment. And so the raw materials, the precious minerals that perhaps go into our products, have lasting effects in the regions of the world where those materials come from. And organizations were not taking responsibility for those. And so we're asking organizations to look at that early on and to say, what can they do to either control the adverse environmental impacts, or what can they do in terms of leveraging positive things by using different types of materials, perhaps less hazardous materials in there, maybe smaller quantities of those materials, so that there's mitigating the negative environmental impact and leveraging the positive ones. But not only what comes into the organizations, we want to look at what the effect of the use of our products in market and the final disposal of our products that the users and customers contribute. And so organizations are asked to look at, again, what can they control, what can they influence, can they provide information to the customers in terms of what are the proper ways to dispose it, can they provide services where the product can be returned and reused, or reused somewhere else in the community. I worked in a company that had used a tremendous amount of pallets, and we were able to, instead of disposing of all of those pallets, provide them to a sod farm so that they can use them in their business. So it was reusing the materials instead of sending them to landfill. So organizations can do very proactive things in terms of their product use and the way the product is finally disposed, or they can just influence it by providing the correct information on the environmental impacts associated with that and proper disposal techniques. So those are the important considerations with the life cycle stages that we want organizations to look at. We call it the life cycle perspective because we want to make the differentiation that it's not a life cycle assessment, it's not a quantification. It's a consideration of each of the stages of a product or service life cycle when you're determining what are your environmental aspects, which ones are significant, and how you're going to control them.
Thank you, Susan, for this very clear explanation. It seems from what both of you have been saying that this new ISO 14001 is really going to be a powerful tool for organizations to take climate action. So we're very excited about that. But there is something that I'm sure will interest a lot of our viewers, and that is what is next for the organizations that have already a certificate to ISO 14001 or are seeking a new certification to ISO 14001. Perhaps Anne-Marie, you can help us with this question.
So we've got in excess of 300,000 organizations worldwide, based on the ISO survey of 2014, that are accredited, certified to ISO 14001. And we are aware that most of those organizations are going to want to be certified to the new version of ISO 14001. And we hope they're all going to go have a successful transition. So International Accreditation Forum and CASCO, which is an organization under ISO, has jointly agreed that there's going to be a 3-year transition period. And that means that for an organization with an existing ISO 14001 certificate, they can take 3 years to make the transition from the 2004 edition of ISO 14001 to the 2015 edition. Many organizations have already made the transition. I noted that on the first day that the standard was published, on the 15th of September, we already saw the first organizations certified by an accredited body to 2015. So it's already happening, it's happening quickly out there, and we will have the usual issues of going backwards and forwards with this. And we're also hoping to see more organizations possibly finding help in the new ISO 14004, which has just gone to for its final vote, to help them make this transition with some of these new changes that Susan and I have been talking about. Thank you.
If I may, can I add something to that?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, so Anne-Marie mentioned the survey, the ISO survey and 300 certifications. That's what we know of. But there are many organizations that use other conformity assessment techniques that we don't really track. ISO can't track all of them. So there are a lot of organizations that are using this standard and will want to transition to the new requirements. Even those that are not certified or perhaps are not ready to come into full conformance with the standard can benefit by looking at the standard and enhancing their own environmental management system program by incorporating the elements that make the most value, make sense for it, and provide the most value to the organization, and take their time. So even though there's a 3-year transition period for certification, organizations can incorporate, you know, the elements that they want as soon as they want and take their time in enhancing their own environmental management.
Thank you, Susan, for this addition and very useful advice for organizations. Well, now we can open the floor up to questions. So if we have a few minutes left, so if you have any questions and are watching this, please post them on the event page or send us a tweet using the hashtag ISO 14001 2015, and we will try and answer as many as we can in the few minutes that we still have left. But perhaps while we wait for any questions, can you tell us a little bit more about the common management system and why is it useful? Either Susan or Anne-Marie, who wants to take the question up?
Well, I suppose I can pick it up. Although both Susan and I have been extensively involved in the work that developed this. So ISO decided, oh good Lord, Susan, sometime in 2005 or something like that, when the first piece happened, the joint work between 9001 and 14001, that it would be useful if management systems looked similar. Many organizations have used more than one. And with so many management systems out there now, I think the last count's well over 30, we have a large number of management systems, and ISO recognized the need for there to be a common framework, a way to make it look similar, a way for terms and definitions to be the same, a way for text to be the same, to have the same implication. And so they developed, and we were a number of us representing all the standard makers across the different management systems that got together and developed this, a common framework for management system standards. And ISO 14001 uses it, ISO 9001 uses it, the new ISO 45001 uses it. So a large number of existing management system standards already uses it, and the idea is that it's meant to help organizations to be able to implement more than one management system or use more than one management system. It also will help translation of the standard in languages other than English, which of course we need to recognize. Thank you.
Okay. One of the issues that you have highlighted as one of the main important differences in this new standard is communication. And can we know a little bit more about what this will mean for the organization? Perhaps Susan, you can take that one?
Sure. So since the last version of 14001, ISO produced, our technical committee produced a standard on environmental communication. It's ISO 14063. And we referred quite a bit to that when we were thinking about what makes sense for the communication portion of 14001. And one of the important things is that organizations need to think about their communication. What's their strategy? Who are the people that it needs to communicate with? What information needs to be communicated, and when they're going to do it, and who's going to do that communication? Should it be top management? Should it be the PR department? Should it be employee to employee or manager to employee communication? So we wanted organizations to, again, think more strategically about its communication process. So we're asking them to establish a process to address who, what, when it will communicate. And then we have some specific requirements about communication. Number one, we want to make sure that the information that is communicated is reliable and that it's consistent with the information that's generated within the environmental management system. So your monitoring and measurement data produces, your monitoring and measurement efforts produce data, and that has information in it that we want to be communicated accurately, comprehensively to the interested parties that need it. We also incorporated a two-way communication mechanism. So we are asking organizations to set up some kind of method so that it can receive input and feedback, both from its own employees and as external parties, about how it can improve. This will help an organization to help get feedback and decide how it can change or improve, enhance its programs. And as I mentioned earlier, in the past, we've always said if there is an external inquiry about your environmental aspects, then the organization has to establish a process to respond to it. But now we're looking at that proactive external communication. And of course, we realize every organization communicates externally, at least to the level that's required by their laws and regulations. But many organizations have websites, talk about their environmental policy, they produce reports, they integrate some environmental reporting into its own annual financial reporting. And so we are expecting organizations, again, in their communication strategy to decide what type of external reporting provides value to it, that it has to be done, and what ones it chooses to be done. And so we address that in their communication strategy.
Thank you, Susan, for this insight on communication. We don't have a lot of time left, but I have received a question on Facebook asking how big is the commercial impact of this new version and whether it's powerful enough to bring new clients. Perhaps Anne-Marie, you would like to take that one?
Well, we might not talk about commercial impact in the conventional sense when we write standards, but I think the changes in ISO 14001, taken together with the changes we have at COP21, the changes we're seeing in the world, will definitely result in more organizations wanting to be part of the ISO 14001 family. And we know that also from the survey that we conducted in 2013, which gave us a really good indication of the benefit that people see in using ISO 14001. For me, that was probably the most important piece of work we've done before we kicked off the revision, because it gave us not only input into the revision, but also gave us a real sense of what are people who are using the standard seeing as benefits as compared to us as standard writers might think what they should be. So yes, I do definitely think there's going to be a significant uptake of ISO 14001 going forward, but it might take us 3 years before we see it, given the transition and changes we're seeing. But changes we will see, that's for sure.
Thank you for this, Anne-Marie. Now, before we go, I would just like to ask one last question to the two of you, and that is there any advice that you would have for organizations that are either transitioning from the previous edition of ISO 14001 or starting afresh on how to approach this new edition of the standard?
I'm going to let Sue start.
Okay. So what my number one advice is to any person, environmental professional or manager in an organization is read the standard, read the requirements, but more importantly, read the annex. In 14001, we have specified the requirements, and we had some constraints or rules associated with how we can write those requirements. But in the annex, we were able to provide more in-depth explanation and guidance for organizations on how to interpret what those requirements mean for it. So I suggest read one of the clauses in the standard and then read the associated annex information on it. I think that's the number one way for them to help understand what the intent of the standard is. But there's also 14004, which is final draft international standard level right now, but should be published very early next year. That provides more information on how to implement the standard. And so it gives practical help and case studies and examples of how organizations have implemented 14001. And then lastly, ISO is working on a handbook particularly for small and medium-sized enterprises, and that should be available next year as well.
Thank you, Sue. I think from my perspective, it's the old comment, the old adage. Change is really scary, and the easiest way of dealing with change is start in a small space. Eat the elephant in small chunks. And ISO 14001 isn't a very big elephant, but it's easier if you start somewhere where you're familiar with it and work with it. You don't have to achieve utopia today. You can do that tomorrow. Thank you very much, Maria.
Thank you, Anne-Marie, and thank you, Susan. And this is pretty much all we have time for today. But as Susan mentioned, there are a number of resources available, and you will be able to find a lot on the ISO website, and there's also a website for the committee. And I will post both of the links on the YouTube description of this video. So thank you, everybody, for joining us, and I hope you've learned something from this event. Bye, Anne-Marie, and bye, Susan, very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everyone. Have a great day.